So this week's series of screencasts, we're going to look at qualitative forecasting and particularly a technique called scenario planning, which I'm going to explain to you in the next three screencasts. We're going to be working on this in class both next week, week 2, and also into week 3. And this is going to help us kind of set the scene for some of the quantitative forecasting that we're going to be moving on to in weeks 4, 5 and 6. So this is an important part of the overall module, and when I do the assignment briefing screencast and when we talk about this in class, I'll explain how this fits into the assessment for this module and how it fits into the process overall for facility planning and planning for businesses generally in the real world. So if we think about last week, at the end of last week, we did the exercise in class which looked at the differences between qualitative and quantitative forecasting techniques. And the task was we looked at different forecasting tasks and asked you to say whether they were micro or macro and whether they were qualitative or quantitative. And we were able to kind of categorize different tasks according to those two aspects, if you like. And what we said was that qualitative approaches are used to answer the what questions in the more distant future. And we said that quantitative approaches, as you might expect, were used to answer the how much, how many questions in the nearer term future. So this week and next week, as I said, the plan is that we will look at qualitative techniques. So we're going to have a proper seminar this week and next week where I will do a bit of briefing and setting up, and I'll be there to support you and work with you one-to-one and in small groups. But really you'll be developing your own scenario forecasts for a sport that you're going to base your assignment around for strategic facility management. So one of the objectives for today is understanding the nature of the environment for sport organisations, because we need to understand what's happening now and in the future if we're going to be able to create scenarios which are realistic about what's going to happen in the future. And the other thing that we're going to work on today in this screencast or these screencasts and for the next 2 weeks in the seminars is that I want you to be able to apply the principles of scenario writing to sport organisations and specifically to the assignment for strategic facility management. Okay, so in the preamble in the workbook, I've talked about how, scenarios have become a bit more commonplace in the news, and because of Brexit, first of all, but particularly because of the global pandemic caused by COVID, we've become quite used to governments and scientists making use of COVID-related scenarios to say, okay, well, if the country was to open up more, and if schools go back, and if universities go back, and if pubs and restaurants are open, and cinemas and sports events are open, and music events, what will that mean to the transmission rate for the virus, the R rate? And if we throw into that things like vaccination rates and the effectiveness of vaccines, then that will have an effect on the R rate and the number of people catching the disease and the capacity that we need in hospitals and so on. And it will also allow us to kind of plan whether we kind of control certain events, whether we go into lockdowns, the vaccination rollout and programme, and what age groups get that. So government is using this to plan what they are going to do in the future and how they might manage circumstances in the future. What you are going to be doing through scenario analysis is you are going to be identifying conditions that might apply under certain scenarios which you will generate in the next couple of weeks. And you're going to say, okay, what do we think is going to happen to demand for my sport relevant to my facilities in this area? Okay, so that's really the goal for today. So the first thing that I want to talk about in this short mini screencast is I want to talk about the dynamic and uncertain environment of the sport industry, because the more dynamic and the more uncertain the industry is, obviously the more difficult it is to forecast with any degree of confidence, and quantitatively. And so qualitative forecasting becomes more important in this kind of set of circumstances which do apply to the sport industry. So this diagram here is taken from a publication which was put out by the Future Foundation. It says on Blackboard there, it isn't on Blackboard at the minute, but I will upload it to the week 2 folder. It's not critical that you read it, but this is a neat diagram. And it talks about these waves that you can see, or these lines represent waves. And so I think if we think about a sea being choppy, we can see that waves come close together if the sea's choppy, and that makes navigating your way around the sea a bit more difficult. If things are very calm, it makes for kind of, pleasant cruising, and maybe navigation is a little bit easier. So this diagram here looks at different kind of areas of the economy, or human life, if you like, or business, or spheres of human activity. So these are the different sectors, and we might say that sport probably belongs in somewhere between popular culture and social trends. And here's a year's kind of time scale going up in 10 years. And the kind of distance in the frequency of the waves shows the kind of rate of change, and the dynamic rate of change that might occur in those different industries. So, for example, the environment, we know, for example, that global warming has been happening since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and has maybe accelerated through the 20th century and the late 20th century as the world has industrialized, and economies have grown, and particularly economies like China and Brazil have joined what were the polluting economies of the Western and Northern hemispheres to really kind of create issues. But we've been able to see that coming, and we know what the effects are probably going to be like. So the change there is happening over a very long time scale. Not necessarily saying that the solutions are easy, but we can see where we're going, and we can see what the end goal is and what we might need to do. So we can make plans over a very long time period to kind of reduce polluting activities, to be carbon neutral as an economy in Britain by 2030. So, we can make decisions like that, but the time scales of change are very long. Infrastructure and demography. Well, demography is very easy to predict. So demography means kind of what's happening to the population, I suppose. And really what we can see is that, given the birth rate, we know what the birth rate is this year. Therefore, we know in 20 years, roughly how many 20-year-olds we will have, and in 40 years, how many 40-year-olds there will be. So we can forecast population change relatively easily. The birth rate may go up or down, but we can look and see what the impact that might have on the demand for schools and school places, or if different sports activities are popular at different age groups. We're able to spot a number of years in advance what the demographic change is going to be, what the population change is going to be, and we're able to plan for that. So here, governance, we can see, that governments, we have elections every 5 years maximum in this country, and so we can see, that swings and change of kind of government happening here. We can see that business probably changes more quickly, but when we get up here, we can see that, things like fashion and music can change very quickly. and that products and businesses have very short life cycles, if you think about the product life cycle, and need to change quickly. And sport probably belongs in that popular culture and social trend area where things change relatively quickly. So the first thing to remember is really that, sport change can happen quickly, and things can change very quickly in 5 or 10 years. So in the slides that we looked at in the week 1 lecture, we saw that swimming had lost an awful lot of swimmers in 10 years, whereas yoga and keep fit had picked up an awful lot of new participants in 10 years. And that increased total demand for yoga and keep fit, but suppressed and decreased total demand for swimming, all in the space of 10 years. So this is borne out by this quote here from Chris Grattan and Peter Taylor from their book in 1987, The Economics of Leisure Services Management. So it's a little bit of an old quote, but it sums up what we're talking about very nicely. So what this quote says is one of the major characteristics of the demand for leisure goods and services is the volatility of such demands. So volatility means unstable or unstable, instability. So you might remember if you did chemistry at school, that certain elements like potassium or sodium are quite unstable. A volatile is the word. And if you drop them into water, they fizz round. Well, that's volatility because it's not stable. It changes quickly. And what Grattan and Taylor says, leisure is an area of consumer demand which as a whole grows slowly over time. So as we become richer, as economies grow, and economies tend to grow over the long term, we may have cycles of recession and growth, but overall, the longward upward trend, certainly in recent history, and I'm talking, the post-war period, so since 1945, has been for economies, the overall trajectory to be one of the country, people, individuals becoming richer, and also at the same time reducing overall the amount of time that they spend at work. And obviously, with AI, machine learning, there are suggestions that, there's going to be in the decades to come further taking over of work by artificial intelligence and machines, which is going to free us up for more leisure time. So leisure as a whole, because of what's happening with the economy and what's happening with kind of work time and leisure time increasing because work time decreases, is that demand increases. But within that leisure sector, within that overall growth, there will be areas of rapid expansion and rapid decline, as we saw in that slide we looked at last week with the decline in swimming and the growth in yoga and keep fit. Okay, so what we're really saying then is that the environment for sport and leisure and culture generally is one where it's fairly dynamic and difficult to predict, and it can be affected by lots and lots of different factors. So here I've got a chart in a way which has got two axes, okay, and here the first axis about environmental conditions goes from simple environmental conditions to complex. Now, simple might be that one or two factors in the environment have a major bearing on demand for sport. Complex might mean that many different factors have a bearing on the demand for sport. Okay, and I would suggest to you that overall, really, the environmental conditions for sport are more complex than they are simple, because demand is not just about what's happening with the economy. It's also about what's happening to work time. It's about what's happening to fashion and tastes and preferences. It's about what's happening with government policy and the supply decisions of suppliers. So many, many factors have an impact on demand and the business environment for sport organisations, which makes forecasting and doing pest and pestle analysis actually quite challenging. If we look at other areas of industry, like the oil or petrochemical industries, then there's a political element to it and what goes on with the politics of some producing countries. But overall, it's simple demand and supply, really. How much oil is being pumped in producing companies, and what's the kind of the rate of growth in demand, and that will affect prices and things. But petrochemicals are seen as more simple, and things like culture and sport are seen as more difficult. The other element here as well in environmental conditions is whether things are static or dynamic. And static means that change happens at a slow pace and in ways that is probably quite easy to predict and see into the future. And that dynamic conditions are one where change happens rapidly and in ways which can be difficult to predict. So if we look at this chart here, we can see that, the popular culture and social trends sector, what you said sport belongs in, change really happens in ways that are difficult to predict and far more quickly than other areas. Okay, so what I'm going to say to you and what we're going to work on in coming weeks is that for the next couple of weeks, we're going to say that really the sport industry is a fairly complex environment where change happens in dynamic, fast and difficult to predict ways. So scenario planning, where instead of you pick one future and you produce numbers for that, because there's a degree of uncertainty because of the complexity and dynamic nature of the environment, it makes sense to produce a number of different scenarios and to try to understand which are the most likely to happen and which have got, the worst implications for demand for your sports facility and which have got probably the best implications. So we often talk about best and worst case scenario. So what I'm going to say to you is certainly for the first part of forecasting for sports facilities, scenario planning is useful because it allows us to develop multiple possible futures, and we are more likely to be able to say what the future might look like if we look at 4 scenarios than if we just look at one scenario and use a quantitative forecast. So if we say that things are simple and static, we might not look at all the different factors. We might just focus on one or maybe 2 scenarios and look at a quantitative technique. Now, in weeks 4 to 7, we are going to look at quantitative techniques, but we're going to anchor those in the scenarios that you produce. Now, if that doesn't make sense to you right now, hopefully it will do in a few weeks once we've completed scenario analysis. And once we've moved into the quantitative forecasting part of the module, I will constantly remind you of how some of this stuff links back to the qualitative scenario planning that we're engaged in this week and next week. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about kind of the nature of the environment. So I'm going to talk in the next screencast a little bit more about how scenario forecasting helps us.